company's cyber controls environment. The company's top security executive, Tim Brown, was also named in the complaint, which seeks unspecified civil penalties, reimbursement of ill-gotten gains, and the executive's removal. In a statement, SolarWinds called the charges unfounded and said it's deeply concerned this action will put our national security at risk. Brown's lawyer, for his part, says the executive performed his responsibilities with diligence, integrity, and distinction. And we
to see it end. But all of us know the imperative of standing up with our allies and partners when their security, when their democracies are threatened. That's what's happening now. We stand resolutely with them, even as we stand resolutely for the protection of innocent civilians.
This playing out Tuesday morning as lawmakers digest Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson's proposal for Israel aid. It's angering Democrats who want to pass an emergency aid package by not only rejecting a White House call to tie aid to Israel with aid to Ukraine, but also offsetting the cost of aid with proposed cuts to the Internal Revenue Service.
And instead of advancing a serious proposal to defend Israel, defend Ukraine, and provide humanitarian aid, this House GOP proposal is clearly designed to divide Congress on a partisan basis, not unite it.
The House is expected to vote on its version of an aid package by Thursday. In Washington, I'm David Aid for Newsnet.
Thank you, David. And chilly weather across much of the country, making it difficult for most trick-or-treaters. Here's Newsnet's Chief Meteorologist Morris Langworthy with more.
And thank you. Well, it's not the spookiest forecast I've ever seen for Halloween, but it definitely
a refugee camp. The largest terror threat to the U.S. since ISIS. American bases overseas are already under attack. Find out why the FBI now says the threat here in the homeland is also on the rise. A new U.S. ambassador to Israel, what's controversial about the just confirmed Biden nominee, and how the White House announced a meeting between President Biden and China's Xi Jinping almost as if by accident. Several protesters interrupt an Israel-related hearing in the Senate, what they asked for, and why the Biden administration is facing pushback on aid to Israel, Ukraine, and Gaza. The struggle at the Supreme Court, the justices tackling two cases on opposite sides of free speech, why it comes down to defining governmental duties on social media. And evacuations in Southern California for a late-season wildfire. Strong winds and dry conditions pose a challenge for firefighters. Israeli airstrikes against Hamas are ramping up in intensity, this time targeting a terrorist and a refugee camp. Forces continue to move further into Gaza, with troops now entering the tunnels to fight Hamas terrorists. NTD's Jason Perry has the latest.
Israel Defense Forces continue to pursue Hamas terrorists in Gaza, even if they try to hide in refugee camps. Photos from Tuesday show the destruction after a strike. An IDF spokesperson confirmed that the attack was carried out by Israeli forces.
I can update you now that there was a very senior Hamas commander in that area. Sadly, he was hiding, again, as they do, behind within civilians. And that's all I can see at this point.
The strike hit Jabalia refugee camp in the north of Gaza, and Israeli forces have been advising civilians to evacuate this area and go to the south.
We know that he was killed. About the civilians there, we're doing everything we can to minimize. I'll say it again. Sadly, they are hiding themselves within civilian population. And again, we are doing this stage by stage, and we're going to go after every one of these terrorists who was involved in that heinous attack on the 7th of October.
Also on Tuesday, the IDF reported killing 50 terrorists, including 2 more Hamas commanders, both of whom helped facilitate the massacre in which over 1,400 innocent civilians were killed in Israel in a surprise terrorist attack. And now, 4 days into ground operations in Gaza, Israel has been fighting terrorists inside the tunnels of the Hamas network. Israel hopes to rescue hostages along the way. The Israeli military says the number of known hostages in Hamas captivity has increased again and is now over 240. But Israel is not only fighting against Hamas, it has also been engaged in cross-border fire exchanges with Iranian-backed groups in Syria as well as Hezbollah in Lebanon. And on Tuesday, another country weighed in on the conflict. A spokesperson for Yemen's Houthis said they've been launching missiles and drones at Israel. He called Israel the enemy and said the operation is in support of Palestinians. The IDF said aerial threats were detected from the area of the Red Sea, and all were intercepted outside of Israel. In January 2021, the Trump administration designated Yemen's Houthis as a terrorist organization. However, the Biden administration reversed the decision, saying the terrorist designation would make it difficult to get humanitarian aid to Yemen. Jason Perry, NTD News.
The most significant terror threat to the U.S. in over a decade. FBI Director Christopher Wray today warning of attacks in the U.S. NTD's Arian Pastar has the highlights from a Senate hearing on threats to the homeland.
The actions of Hamas and its allies will serve as an inspiration, the likes of which we haven't seen since ISIS launched its so-called caliphate several years ago.
FBI Director Christopher Wray on Tuesday warning of an increased terrorism threat at a Senate hearing on threats to the homeland. He says since Hamas attacks on Israel, multiple terrorist organizations have called for attacks against America and the West. The number of attacks on U.S. military bases overseas has already increased sharply to 25 attacks in just the last 2 weeks, according to reports. But it's not only overseas. Wray says the call for attacks by these terrorist groups also raised the threat posed by violent extremists already in the United States. It also raises questions about illegal immigration. Senator Roger Marshall asked Homeland Security's Alejandro Mayorkas how many illegal immigrants in the U.S. have ties to terrorist organizations such as Hamas, ISIS, or others.
Is it tens? Is it hundreds? Is it thousands?
An individual who poses a risk to our national security is our highest enforcement priority. And if
So you don't know the answer to the question?
And if detention is indeed warranted by reason of the risk they present, then we indeed detain them.
Do you have an answer for my question?
I believe I have answered your question.
No, sir, you didn't.
Mayorkas did confirm that the U.S. saw over 600,000 illegal immigrants avoid capture this fiscal year, so-called gotaways. Arguably, the most heated exchange at Tuesday's hearing was between Senator Josh Hawley and Mayorkas. Hawley showed tweets of a Homeland Security immigration officer praising Hamas attacks on Israel on the day of the attacks. Hawley asked what Homeland Security has done about this. Mayorkas replied, calling the question despicable. Here's what followed.
Have you fired her? Don't come to this hearing room when Israel has been invaded and Jewish students are barricaded in libraries in this country and cannot be escorted out because they are threatened for their lives. You have employees who are celebrating genocide, and you are saying it's despicable for me to ask the question?
Mayorkas later clarified he finds the question despicable because he has close family ties to Holocaust survivors. The employee has been put on administrative leave, but hasn't been fired. Arian Pastar, NTD News.
And many people still don't recognize it. People like me who lived through communism, especially those who lived through the Cultural Revolution, we see it right away. We recognize all the signs, and we know it's the same thing. And the Cultural Revolution in China was launched by Mao to do two things. One is to get absolute power for himself. Another is fundamentally transform China in his own image. And we see the same thing happening here. It is about those elite or globalists trying to get absolute power. In the process, they want to fundamentally transform America, get rid of the founding principles that made this country great.
And on that last part, what are some of the key principles and values that make America unique in your view and are worth preserving?
Yeah, first of all, this is the only country that's founded on the belief that we were created by our creator, and that's where we get our rights. And this is something that took me a long time to grasp. Growing up in China, I always believed that our rights were given to us by the government. And so that is fundamentally a different way of understanding who we get our rights from. And America is unique in the history of mankind. So because we have that right, and no one can take it away, not any government should be able to take away from us, especially in America. You know, we are protected by our Constitution, and our founding father was so wise. They also gave us the Second Amendment, and those things are our ways to make sure no one can take away our rights.
You survived. Facing opposition in Congress to President Biden's $106 billion request for emergency funding to Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, and more. NTD's Melina Weisskopf reports from Capitol Hill.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Antony Blinken are trying to make the case to a divided Congress that the conflicts in Ukraine and Israel are linked, using this as the reasoning before a group of senators.
Since we cut off Russia's traditional means of supplying its military, it's turned more and more to Iran for assistance. In return, Moscow has supplied Iran with increasingly advanced military technology.
The two cabinet secretaries persisted through many disruptions during the hearing as anti-war protesters shouted, "Ceasefire and save the children of Gaza." But pushback on this White House request doesn't stop with the protesters. Many lawmakers are opposed to this White House funding request, though for a different reason. Republicans want to fund Israel now and deal with Ukraine later, taking a more critical approach to how those funds in Ukraine are spent. This has caused some Republican senators to break with their Senate leader, Mitch McConnell.
Well, I don't think we need to hold up Israel aid. I mean, let's get that done. We can come back and talk about all the other things the president wants, Ukraine, Taiwan. We'll see. I just hope that the Democrats don't slow this down and hold Israel aid hostage.
Some Democrats are arguing that separating Ukraine and Israel aid would make it appear that the U.S. is now letting Russia off the hook.
That much of the rest of the world will interpret that as the United States does not stand with Ukraine.
The House Speaker met with the Secretary of State today to discuss this impasse. And another issue that some are having with Biden's funding request is that the aid to Gaza could end up in the hands of the Hamas militant group.
They're hoarding supplies for themselves. They're hoarding fuel so they can lob more bombs at Israel.
She, along with a group of senators, are now urging Senate Leader Chuck Schumer to reject this $9 billion humanitarian aid request from President Biden and ensure guardrails to make sure that this money to Gaza does not ultimately end up in the hands of the terrorist group. Reporting from Capitol Hill, Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
Former President Trump is dominating the GOP presidential candidates in the early primary state of South Carolina.
How his organization intends to shape the economic future of the world. Watch.
If you look at all the challenges, we can speak about the multi-crisis. Economic, political, social, and ecological, and institutional crisis. But actually, what we have to confront is a deep, systemic, and structural restructuring of our world. And this will take some time. And the world will look differently after we have gone through this transition process.
Part of that plan includes what Klaus calls stakeholder capitalism, where companies are beholden not to shareholders who invest in the company, but instead to stakeholders. Klaus defines them as anybody with a vested interest in the outcomes that company creates in the world. Of course, in reality, it seems that only those with power and influence are going to be the ones having their voices heard. To talk more about this issue of globalist organizations like the WEF imposing the will upon all of us is Mark Morano. He's publisher of Climate Depot, and he's also author of The Great Reset, Global Elites, and the Permanent Lockdown. Mark Morano, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Joshua. Happy to be here.
So Klaus Schwab, I mean, he's not even trying to hide his agenda. He's been open about it for like 50 years. How did we get to the point where like the wealthy globalists like the WEF and the UN, that they actually have sway over governments now? Like, how did we get here?
Well, it's been, a long process, and it's been a steady process. If you remember, I think it was 1990, George H.W. Bush, there was concerns of the New World Order, which was sort of a variation of this. It was with the collapse of the old Soviet Union. The idea was that we were going to have this New World Order. And the New World Order was going to consist of, with the collapse of the old Soviet Union, environmentalism, in the rise, if you will, of corporate power beyond something we hadn't seen before. And then, of course, you had the rise of China over the last 20 years as, from their economic base. Remember, back in the 90s, if you remember, all of our overtures to China were say, hey, well, they're going to become just like us if we can give them enough aid and open up their markets and help them develop. The problem is we became like them the more they gutted our industrial base and took over American manufacturing. So I think the way it happened was they used fear, mostly those in climate and in COVID. And this whole agenda goes back to Woodrow Wilson's presidency with the idea of the expertocracy, the administrative state where ruled by experts, where unless you went to an Ivy League school and got an advanced degree, you're basically not smart enough to run your own life. These are experts. You defer in your decisions of consequential life. They will run your life. You can just worry about the things immediately in front of you, your day-to-day. And this is what Woodrow Wilson was sold on and wanted to start implementing. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a similar thing. And in order to have that philosophy that basically we, the unwashed masses, can't take care of ourselves, that we have to be ruled by people who are smarter than us, you have to have big government. And so one of FDR's kitchen cabinet advisors, Stuart Chase, in the 1930s and 40s had a vision of basically a great reset. It was state control of agriculture, government control of transportation and energy, and he actually called government control of propaganda, or the media and information. So this has been around for centuries, and it's really in the United States and the Western world, there have been ebbs and flows. You could argue, Ronald Reagan's presidency fought it back, and then Donald Trump, but March of 2020 is what we focus on because that's when the whole world changed and we really haven't recovered, and there's really nothing to prevent that from happening again. There's been no real legislation other than the state of Florida to reform, and now Texas is joining them, to stop future lockdowns. But we need public health reform. We need to reform emergency powers because what's happened is they can come right back at us again. In March of 2020, the entire once free Western world copied one-party rule China, quite simply by the most consequential decisions of our life. We're no longer up for democracy. We were told what to do under emergency decree, and that is what the same template they'd like to use for climate.
Well, let's talk about that because, it looked like Joe Biden was going to do this whole, climate emergency. In fact, like the entire media establishment looked like they were trying to make him do it. Like he doesn't seem like he wants to, but it looks like they're trying to push him to do it. He gave them the money. He gave them everything they wanted, like on paper, other than the emergency. Why do they want the emergency so bad?
Well, okay, yeah, you're exactly right. They want him to do it. Now, a year ago, in July of 2022, Biden was set to declare this. The Washington Post, the Associated Press, talking to White House sources, were all saying he was set to declare it. What happened then? Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, caved and gave in and did the Inflation Reduction Act, which had nothing to do with inflation. It was just a pork barrel spending bill aimed at green energy, so-called. And then you fast forward a year, it boils back up again, this idea. So you had the Weather Channel reporter pretty much begging Joe Biden, like almost saying, how dare you, we had bad weather here, and we had bad weather here. Isn't that enough? Why haven't you declared it? And of course, Biden said he practically declared it. He's been urged by AOC, by Bernie Sanders, by Senator Schumer, by Senator Markey, by Green New Deal activists to all declare a climate emergency. The entire establishment wants him to declare it. I don't know why he hasn't done it yet as we sit here in September 2023. I still expect it because it'd be a great way for him to finish out a lame duck term because it would give him powers. The Center for Biological Diversity estimates that a national climate emergency would give Joe Biden 130 new executive powers. And NBC News just a couple weeks ago actually reported it would be powers similar to the 9/11 emergency decree and the COVID emergency decree. This could theoretically extend to governors and mayors. We could be in a sort of lockdown 2.0. This time it wouldn't be, but with same themes, stay at home. We have climate activists saying you can't
back
get
to
on an
censorship
airplane,
too.
without a morally justified reason during a declared climate emergency. We have governments already laying out plans for odd, even gas station days, restrictions on travel. We have utilities working with local governments to control thermostats during heat waves. You have the LA Times suggesting that due to the climate emergency, we should use blackouts to help meet emission goals. And in a battle with the New York Times, by the way, the New York Times is saying summer vacations are coming to an end, and they actually quoted people as saying that they stayed home and huddled around their air conditioner because the heat was so bad they didn't want to go anywhere, including the beach. But the LA Times said, well, we can't have people huddling at home with their individual home air conditioner. We need community cooling centers. So they're suggesting under a climate emergency that people would be picked up by city transport, taken to a cooling center. Now, this is a battle between the two two coastal elites, the New York Times on the East Coast, the LA Times on the West Coast. And the idea, it's like the old East and West Coast rapper battle we used to have back in the 90s. But the New York Times is saying, stay home and huddle your air conditioner. The LA Times is saying, no, you can't. You got to go to a community cooling center. We can't afford individual air conditioning. They've laid it out very clearly why the establishment, why the ruling class wants a climate emergency, because it's going to limit us in ways that we haven't seen since the height of COVID.
I'm just worried about what they might do to the cows.
Be held directly and demand political change, but now people mainly complain about economic losses.
For the first time, the U.S. has started buying Japanese seafood to supply its military in the country. That's in a bid to offset China's import ban on the country's seafood. Beijing imposed it after Japan released treated wastewater from its Fukushima plant in August. In announcing the initiative, U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, said it would begin with purchases of scallops before expanding to all types of Japanese seafood.
China will continue its economic coercion, but the best way we have proven in all the instances to kind of wear out China's economic coercion is come to the aid and assistance of the targeted country or industry. So this is one step.
Emanuel said the purchases would feed soldiers and be sold in shops and restaurants on military bases. He said the U.S. military had not previously purchased local seafood in Japan. Beijing was once the biggest buyer of Japanese seafood globally. The regime says its import ban is due to food safety fears. The UN nuclear watchdog has vouched for the safety of Japan's water release. Next, a special segment shines a light on the Chinese Communist Party's infiltration into one democratic country, with Communist China to its west and a shared border with Communist North Korea. Democratic values and the way of life South Koreans enjoy are facing an imminent challenge.
To see it end. But all of us know the imperative of standing up with our allies and partners when their security, when their democracies are threatened. That's what's happening now. We stand resolutely with them, even as we stand resolutely for the protection of innocent civilians.
This playing out Tuesday morning as lawmakers digest Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson's proposal for Israel aid. It's angering Democrats who want to pass an emergency aid package by not only rejecting a White House call to tie aid to Israel with aid to Ukraine, but also offsetting the cost of aid with proposed cuts to the Internal Revenue Service.
And instead of advancing a serious proposal to defend Israel, defend Ukraine, and provide humanitarian aid, this House GOP proposal is clearly designed to divide Congress on a partisan basis, not unite it.
The House is expected to vote on its version of an aid package by Thursday. In Washington, I'm David Aid for Newsnet.
Thank you, David. And chilly weather across much of the country, making it difficult for most trick-or-treaters. Here's Newsnet's chief meteorologist Morris Langworthy with more.
And thank you. Well, it's not the spookiest forecast I've ever seen for Halloween, but it definitely.
America, if this trend continues unchecked, what do you see as the consequences for America?
Yeah, the most obvious thing to me is the identity politics. That's exactly what Mao and the CCP did to divide the Chinese population into two classes, the red class and the black class. And the people can probably figure out what it means. The red is good. Black is bad. The black were the oppressors, and then the red is oppressed, and set them against each other. And that's exactly what happened in America, that identity politics divide people into different races, different genders, sexuality, and they infinitely divide people and make them enemies of each other. And that's what we see, the hatred. And then the kind of the hatred among between different groups. And that is exactly what happened during the Cultural Revolution. People were willing to kill the others just because they belong to the wrong class, the black class. Millions died as the result.
Documents, obscure blog posts that were like pulling out of context and making hay out of. This is them saying the quiet parts out loud. And the reason it might sound like, gee, it seems like the UN and the World Economic Forum are all on the same page. It's because they're at the same exact meetings. I've been to them. I go to a UN climate summit. I just went to one. I've been to about 18 in the last 20 years. The last one was in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt, in November 2022. You had the World Economic Forum there basically trying to merge COVID and climate together as a public health threat. You have the United Nations there. You have every major corporation there. You have all the bureaucrats. You have billionaire funders. You had Ukraine delegation there actually talking about how Putin fears green energy more than anything. It was literally like bizarro world. Like it was not even potentially true at any level, but this is what passes for what they do at these summits. So it's the same people colluding. The World Health Organization declares climate an existential threat of the 21st century. Then you have the Biden administration saying that the Health and Human Services is going to start naming heat waves like they do hurricanes and coming up with death tolls from heat waves. Wait a minute. Death tolls from heat waves that are climate caused? That means, yes, CNN, NBC, climate death tolls on your screen daily. Annual death tolls, very similar to COVID. We have doctors in Canada, starting a whole doctors group. The first medically diagnosed patient is suffering from climate change. Doctor actually wrote it in her chart, the head of the emergency room at a hospital, major hospital in Canada. We have academics in Australia in a peer-reviewed journal arguing that climate change should be included as a cause of death on death certificates. So you can be diagnosed with climate change, you can die from climate change, you're going to have heat waves. Corporate government collusion. Harvard University has said unchecked climate change leads to more viruses. So if you don't support the Green New Deal, you are now a grandma killer. This is how they've done it. And everything I just mentioned, Joshua, is a shared interest collusion between all of these international groups, the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and the World Health Organization. And you mentioned something the most frightening of all, probably more consequential than the Climate Emergency Declaration, and that's the Pandemic Treaty. Let's not forget that Bill Gates is probably close with the United States and China as the #1 funder of the World Health Organization. What a pandemic treaty is, and when time's running out, Biden administration is all for getting the United States to sign on this. But what it would do is give Bill Gates funded scientists at the World Health Organization the ability to declare a public health emergency. And as you mentioned, that could include guns. That could include misinformation requiring censorship. That could include a virus. That could include climate-fueled bad weather. They can order, for any member nation in the United States, of course, would be tied to this, instant global lockdowns, global vaccine mandates, mask mandates, all sorts of restrictions, except this time it won't be coming from your your good old-fashioned dictatorial governor like Governor Whitmer or Governor Cuomo or Gavin Newsom. This will be coming from unelected bureaucrats at the World headquarters in Europe. I mean, this is so telegraphed and out in the open that no one's seen it, and no one's even aware. The average person in the public, you would have less than 0.2% even know there's a pandemic treaty on the table that has this kind of consequence for their future lives and the lives of their children.
But I mean, I think the big question people have is we see them doing all this stuff, right? It looks like there's a bunch of crazy people like pulling the strings of government.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for myself and maybe a lot of my viewers, and maybe for you too, we feel like there's some other goal outside of the surface narrative. Like, what are they trying to do? What do you believe that the real end goal of all these things are? I personally don't believe that they believe in climate change. Maybe some of them do. I don't think that's the real agenda. Like, what do you think the real end goal of all this is?
The real end agenda is it's all about control. I mean, you could call it a neo-feudalism. When they look at world history, okay, it's very simple. And in my book, I go back 2 decades. You can go back to the pages of the New York Times, Tom Friedman, praising China's one-party rule, calling their unelected leadership enlightened. You have Justin Trudeau saying he admires China's basic dictatorship. You have the Apple CEO saying Apple's values and China's values are in alignment. You have Obama administration officials saying this out loud. You have Klaus Schwab saying this. So all the organs, and you have China, taking over and funding and running Harvard medical community, Harvard medical staff, and their public health division. So all the organs of the public health establishment have admired China's one-party authoritarian rule for decades. Documented, the major figures all saying it out loud. Biden's Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm most recently just saying in comments praising China. And what did lockdowns and COVID lockdowns bring? It brought the once free West emulating one-party rule in China. This is the reason John Kerry came out in 2020 and said, COVID and climate, the parallels are screaming at us. And this is why you had Jamie Margolis, the Teen Vogue activist, say, if we can shut down the world for a virus, we can do the same thing for climate change. In other words, their goal all along has been to evolve us to something related to what China has been following. And that's what COVID brought about to the world. And that's why Anthony Fauci and the public health and his replacement and the CDC and NIH and World Health, they all want to go full bore the same exact tactics again next time. And they want to keep this up. That's what a pandemic treaty, because as I mentioned in the open here, the idea is that this is the philosophy. You can't say they're all evil. I think what their resolve is going to be evil. But many of these people truly believe that we are unwashed masses, that we need to be regulated and essentially have experts guide us in every aspect of our life. Because if left to our own devices, we the masses will create inequity, racism, environmental destruction, a climate crisis, and they need to come in. They're saving the world, and they may not see the climate crisis as real, but they just see it as a more orderly society. We are nothing but privates, and these are military 5-star generals. Our job is to follow their orders. It's for our own good. They're not going to allow any dissent or questioning of their orders because it messes up their plan. This is what the ruling class has always wanted. Throughout history, this is what we've been battling. In fact, in my book, I quote a BBC historian who talks about how they use emergency powers, have ended democracies. The Roman Republic descent into an empire was due to abuse, in part, due to an abuse of emergency powers. Abuse of emergency powers during the Middle Ages led to centralization of power. Adolf Hitler in Germany in the 1930s used emergency powers to crush any remaining democracy in Germany. The 9/11 emergency power gave us essentially the Patriot Act and domestic surveillance, which then led to years later Joe Biden's Justice Department declaring angry parents at school board meetings to be domestic terrorists. Then you had the COVID declaration, which again, we've already gone through, bypassed the most consequential decisions of your life were made without an ounce of democracy. So you see why they liked the COVID declaration of a climate emergency, the climate emergency declaration, and you see why they liked these emergency powers in general because they praise China. They want to model it after. You had Roosevelt's cabinet members openly praise this model of government back in the 1930s. So it's deep within our political psyche and our ruling class that they should be a more dominant and forceful ruling class, and that's why they love crises, whether it's terrorism, war, viruses, climate. They're not going to let it go. And until we wise up, these are some of the greatest advances overnight in March of 2020 in this agenda that had happened in the previous 100 years. It happened as rapidly as you've ever seen it because of that.
Yeah, I mean, they say it openly. Never let a good crisis go to waste. Mark Morano, thank you so much for explaining this. Really appreciate it. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
This is a fate worse than death. But they also saw some incredibly powerful lights that shone in the darkness. Both of my parents were ultimately saved in different ways by the great Swedish humanitarian Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat from neutral Sweden who left the safety and security of his life there to come to Hungary at the height of the Hungarian Holocaust with one mission, and that was to try and rescue as many innocent Jewish lives as possible. And my mother tells me that they called him their Moses from the north, and that light really did shine in the darkness. And so I think both my sister and I really learned from my parents two lessons, two sides of the coin: the depths of depravity, which human beings are capable of inflicting on each other, and the heights of humanity to which they can rise.
And so when you see what's happening and unfolding in Israel today, and the turmoil that they're having with Hamas, and then the vitriol that we're seeing on college campuses in America and throughout the world, where pro-Palestinians and pro-Hamas are basically supporting Hamas. I understand the plight of the Palestinian people and the fact that they're caught up in this, but let's not forget that Hamas is the ruling party and really the occupying force in the Gaza. So to that end, when you have an enemy that's vowed to take you out because of your Jewish faith, what does that say to you as someone who grew up in a home of Holocaust survivors who were able to go out and champion the rights of freedom for everyone?
Well, your question is profound and so beautifully phrased. I would say a few things. First of all, I would say that, as Winston Churchill so memorably said, when you are going through hell, keep going. Hell has come to Israel, and genocide and absolute destruction is what Hamas has promised to bring. And so I think we have to, in a clear-eyed way, understand that Israel has no choice but to eliminate Hamas. And if you think back again to the Second World War, both Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt agreed on a policy of unconditional surrender. They knew that in dealing with the embodiment of evil, which was the Nazi regime, you couldn't look for an armistice or a ceasefire or an effort just to stop the fighting, as much as everybody would love to see that happen. There had to be the utter destruction of the Nazi regime. And one of the lessons of history is that what was able to be built out of that utter destruction of the Nazi regime was modern Germany, modern Japan, democratic allies, strong supporters of the rule of law, of democracy, of human rights, being let in.
That's a great question. Why are they letting them in? The Biden administration has a program that allows immigrants to apply for entry on a mobile phone app called CBP One. They don't seem to be too concerned about letting people from all over the world use that app to schedule an appointment and then get into the country through the ports of entry. And my most recent reporting, which is based on FOIA records, shows that the administration was actually approving applications from people who are from terror watch listed countries, designated countries of interest. like all over the Middle East, Iran and Lebanon and Jordan and Tunisia and Lebanon, all the Central Asian countries and the Caucasus and that sort of thing. And it got to the point where Senator Charles Grassley decided to write a letter demanding answers about, like, what are you doing for security vetting on these people, bringing them in over the bridges? 7,300 plus during 2023 alone from countries of interest, 24 different countries of interest. Hopefully the senator's letter will be well received. I don't think it will, but hopefully it will, and that we will finally get answers to that question and others that Grassley asked.
And to your point, Border Patrol is warning that Hamas terrorists may be crossing over into the country from the southern border. Now, there's a sheriff's group saying it's too little too late. They're citing the over 2 million gotaways already scattered across this country. Is it too late in your view?
Yes, it's far too late. But I always say better late than never, because you can at least, mitigate risk somewhat if you could get a handle on it and stop allowing people in. But they're right. We've let in, close to 2 million, probably more. They got away. We never even laid hands on them. They got away. We know that. Probably far more than 2 million. And they've been hemorrhaging into the country since Inauguration Day 2021. So that's really the big question, is who got in that we didn't know about. We know that we caught 270 people who are on the FBI's terrorism watch list. We know that. Huge record, by the way. That is, may not sound like much, but if that's the test tube of water that you tested over here in the whole body of the lake, that's not a good test. That means that the bigger body of water probably has also, some contaminants in it, so to speak. So this is not a good thing at all that we have so many gotaways.
Definitely not.
And 270 that didn't get away that we know are on the FBI's terror watch list.
As you mentioned, that is a record. You also touched on how it's better late than never when it comes to mitigating these risks. What is the solution here? What are the concrete steps the U.S. must take now?
Well, the quickest solution,
kick them out.
if you're from the migrants' point of view, from their point of view, is if they were to spend $10,000 to get to the border, that they should know that they're going to get pushed back and stuck in Mexico. So remain in Mexico is the solution. It's the immediate solution. It's survived all the court challenges all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it is a viable, legally viable program that they could use immediately. And from the perspective of the immigrants, you're not coming if you're going to end up in Mexico. Nobody comes for the great Mexican dream. They come to be released into the U.S. and hopefully disappear, and nobody will ever come find them. But if they're stuck in Mexico, they're staying home in the first place. And I think that's what needs to happen, is deportation, repatriation to home countries on a sizable enough scale that it reduces the odds that your smuggling money is going to pay off enough, and then they're staying home. Right now, it's the exact opposite. 100% of anybody and everybody who reaches that border is going to get in one way or another, through the CBP One app or illegally, and then be allowed in. Almost nobody gets deported anymore.
How can you tell when a politician's lying? They smile and move their lips.